All His Pretty Girls by Charlie Cox. Chapter 3. Monday, March 25, 8 a.m. Callie opened the shower door, steam billowing behind her. Absently, she pulled a towel off the heated towel rack, something she didn't know existed until she'd met Rafe. Thinking of all the things she needed to get accomplished today, she considered writing a list. Not that she necessarily needed it. She just felt more of a sense of achievement when she could mark things off. In fact, there were times when she made her list, did something that wasn't already on it, then wrote it down simply so she could cross it off. Oh well, she thought, there were worse things in life than being obsessive-compulsive. As she stood there debating whether or not to pen in her to-do list, she heard scorpions singing, Wind of Change, and she scrambled to answer the phone before it went to voicemail. Hello, she said breathlessly. Busy? Her husband asked. Did he sound irritated, or was it just her imagination? Just got out of the shower. Why? Sometimes Rafe called just to chat, but more often he needed her to do something. I called the surface shop to have your transmission looked at. You have an appointment at 9. Can you make that? Callie glanced at the clock sitting on her nightstand. 8:07. If she hurried, she could make it. She stiffed her frustration that Rafe rarely considered what her schedule may look like before he made appointments for her. Sighing, she reminded herself he was only trying to be helpful, even if it was mainly because he was tired of hearing her nag about the trouble with her car. For weeks, an awful grinding and clunking sound had been heard under the hood. If only she'd paid attention when her father had tried to teach her about vehicles, she might have been able to figure it out herself. Growing up, she understood her family couldn't afford to take their car somewhere else to be repaired, but as a teenager, she couldn't be bothered to learn, and even though she could now afford simply buying another vehicle, like Rafe urged her to do, she liked her Jeep. Sure, it can make that. I'll just move some things around, Callie said. Good. He paused, then added, I tried calling you earlier, but it went straight to voicemail. This time the accusation in his voice was clear. I was either in the shower or talking to Terry. She pulled her phone away from her ear long enough to see what she had indeed missed, a call. Well, I need to finish getting ready so I'm not late. She hesitated a beat before adding, Thanks for calling the shop for me. No problem. See you tonight. See? Rafe was already gone. Alrighty then, she said, setting the phone on the sink. Before she donned her skirt and blouse, she stood in front of the mirror, examining her body from various angles, frowning as she did, unhappy at the few extra pounds she'd packed on. Even though Rafe hadn't specifically said anything about it, she felt like he looked at her differently. It's not entirely my fault. I've gained a little weight, she said to her image. With all the charity boards Rafe wants me on, it's not like I have much time to hit the gym. Where they'd first met 9.5 years ago, theirs had been a whirlwind romance with him, treating her to fancy dinners at fancy restaurants, with menus that didn't bother to display prices. Places which, in her world, existed only in movies, and before she'd known what was happening, they were married. She feared the concept of further change in her body was the main reason behind her husband's refusal to discuss the possibility of her becoming pregnant. Before they'd married, they had agreed on waiting 5 years before trying. That time had elapsed by an additional 4+ years. Callie shook her head. She didn't have time to ponder why her husband suddenly clammed up when she brought up the subject of adding to their family of 2. Before her emotions could get away from her, she slapped on some eyeshadow and mascara, then dried and brushed her long, unruly hair before tying it back into a low ponytail. After another quick peek in the mirror, she deemed her appearance good enough and grabbed her purse, making sure to slip her e-reader into her pocket. She wanted to have something to do while she waited for her vehicle to be serviced. Unlike Rafe, she was unable to sit for more than 15 minutes without having a book to read or a puzzle to solve. In the garage, she climbed into her Jeep and started it, winced at the sound that escaped from beneath the hood. She was glad it was a short drive to the dealership service station. 5 minutes after she arrived, Callie handed her keys to the service technician and went to the lobby, prepared to sit for the next hour or so. So far, she was the only customer inside. She spotted a freshly brewed pot of coffee sitting in the corner of the room and helped herself to a cup, taking a small sip to test its bitterness. She nodded in approval. It was better than most service station coffees. Even so, she added a liberal amount of sugar and cheap powdered creamer to improve the taste. On her way back to her seat, she stopped to pursue the various magazines strewn about and decided she really didn't need to read about 15 ways to please your man, or the top 10 things your man wants you to do, but is too afraid to ask. Really? Who supplied this stuff? She glanced around the little room, but saw no newspapers in sight, which was good because she was on a self-imposed media strike, refusing to read or watch what was going on in the corrupt world around her. Some days she even refused to watch the Weather Channel, something that irritated Rafe. As Callie made her way across the lobby, she glanced at the television in the corner, recognizing the current morning show as one she used to enjoy. She sat in a chair furthest from the mechanic's workshop, but closest to the window. She set her purse and bottled water in the seat next to her, settled in, and grabbed her e-reader, ready to continue the romantic suspense story she'd started late the night before while Rafe watched some reality show he was currently addicted to. She'd been reading for approximately 10 minutes when another customer, an older man, walked into the room. He looked to be in his late 60s and was hunched over, wearing a red flannel shirt and worn jeans with holes in the knees and frayed edges on the hems. He reminded her of the cranky neighbor she had had as a child. She watched as his eyes wandered the room before he chose the chair next to her. There was a small table separating the two of them, and Callie wondered why in the world the man would choose to sit practically on top of her when there was plenty of available seating. Slightly annoyed, she went back to reading. She jumped when the man suddenly exclaimed, "I don't believe it. No one wants to work at anything anymore. If it ain't easy, just give up." Callie glanced up to see if he was speaking to her or merely talking out loud. Since he was staring at the television, she turned to look. Someone had changed the channel and turned up the sound, but she'd been so absorbed in her story she hadn't noticed. The news anchors, or whatever they were called, were discussing yet another celebrity couple who had announced they were splitting up after 9 years of marriage, but who still loved each other and remained steadfast friends. Callie had no interest in these particular stars, so she simply smiled at the man and returned to the story in her hand, hoping he would take the hint and leave her alone. I mean, don't these people realize marriage takes a bit of effort? Don't you agree? It was obvious she wasn't going to get out of this conversation, so, sigh, she turned to the man. Yes, marriage isn't an easy venture, but my husband and I have always worked hard at ours, she said while playing with her 2-carat, pear-shaped wedding ring, though it seems like one of us tries harder than the other, she thought. To her dismay, her comment allowed the man to jump into a conversation about the disastrous marriages that had fallen the country in the last half-century. Callie listened politely while glancing down superstitiously, noticing that he wasn't wearing a ring. Of course, not all married couples had a double ring ceremony, but it was fairly uncommon not to, and not all men wore their rings. In fact, her father had rarely worn his, afraid he'd get it caught in one of his woodworking machines. While the man droned on, she began to suspect he was lonely and just happy to have an attentive audience. He was certainly friendly, the type she'd never wanted to sit next to on a long plane ride. When she was in the air, she wanted to lose herself in sleep or a novel, not in the life story of a passenger she'd likely never see again. "Would you like me to get you another cup?" The man interrupted her thoughts, pointing at her now empty styrofoam cup. "What? Oh, that's kind of you, but no thank you. I've had my limit of caffeine for today. I've got my water here," she said, holding up her bottle. "You probably like that fancy stuff they get on every corner anyway," he said before launching into a commentary about how shameful it was that so many large companies were running mom-and-pop shops out of business. She almost confessed that Rafe owned a couple of those fancy coffee shops. Instead, she accepted she wasn't going to get any further reading done, and not wanting to run her battery down, she closed her e-reader and gave her almost full attention to the talkative gentleman. She was in for quite the friendly conversation, like it or not. As he spoke, she noticed certain details. For instance, he wore a buzz cut, hinting at a possible past military career, and spoke with a slight accent, though she couldn't quite place it. His voice was smooth and warm, grandfatherly almost. She was still trying to place his accent when she realized he was asking her a question. "I hope that's not too far forward." She blinked. Forward? She obviously tuned out more than she realized. "I said I like that color." He nodded toward her blouse. "It looks good on you, especially with your hair color. Blondes have more fun, right?" He winked, then added, "I always liked when my wife wore blue." Thank you," she said, feeling awkward. She scooted herself further into her chair, hoping she wasn't being obvious about it. As she did, the man's words sank in. Liked, wore, past tense. The man started to twist the ring that wasn't on his finger before he realized what he was doing. "I work a lot with my hands and had to take my ring off. I still forget it's not there." "My dad used to do the same thing," Callie assured the man. When a minute passed in silence, Callie began to hope he was finished, but then he bounced right back into another story, content to carry the conversation himself. She was relieved when the door jingled, and 3 more customers, 2 elderly gentlemen and a younger man, entered the lobby. After checking in with the receptionist, the 2 older men took seats on the opposite side of the room, close to the television in the corner, while the younger man randomly grabbed a magazine, and after taking a quick sweep of the seating situation, sat where he could easily see everyone, and proceeded to read. She hoped her new friend would include them in his dialogue, so she could continue reading. Nope, no such luck. Finally, after more than an hour and a half of a very, God help her, detailed conversation, with some of it excruciating, the service technician announced her car was ready. Callie stood and gathered her belongings before she could make her way to the counter. The man also stood. He grabbed one of her hands in both his and shook it vigorously. "It was so nice to meet you. It was so kind of you to listen to the old man's rambling." The man turned a little red, and she felt guilty for wishing he'd stop yammering. It was a pleasure listening to you, she lied. Have a great day. She walked to the counter and paid her bill, waving to the man one last time before walking out the door. As soon as she got in her car and drove away, she pushed the weird conversation to the back of her mind and focused instead on the things she wanted to get done. She never noticed anyone staring at her intently as she left.